Hi, so my name is Menachem Fromer, and I'm one of the data science leads at Verily Life Sciences. And Verily Life Sciences is has its parent company Alphabet, which is also the parent company of Google. It started out as Google X Life Sciences a number of years ago, and now we focus on building certain platforms and delivering for delivery of healthcare and for running clinical trials. And I'll talk to you a little bit today about how we've been working on mental health and really scalable measurement of mental health. So it's my pleasure to be here. Nice to meet all of you virtually, of course. So what's on the agenda today? So as I said, I'm going to talk about how we've built up some scalable real-world digital data platforms to better understand mental health. And part of doing that is understanding user-centric design so that we can engage users in participating in our real-world studies and collect data. And then, of course, the next step was to actually deploy those in some large-scale studies to give us the best shot at creating machine learning models of disease and clinical outcomes focused on mental health. Once we start those studies, one of the things that's apparent, and was apparent even before that, was the issues of data quality that would come up, and I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the details we've learned there. Once we've collected the data, done some quality control QC, we start thinking about derivation of physiological and behavioral metrics from the platforms where we collect data. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about clinical data modeling, and the way we think about that is framing it as relating non-traditional digital data to traditional outcomes. And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that soon. So let me focus on the scalable real-world digital platforms that we built. So first of all, to frame the problem, we really thought that there's an analytic opportunity here for mental health in other disease areas, and two examples that I have up here are cardiology and oncology. What we've seen is that really having additional modalities of measurement for cardiology, it might be physiological and molecular measures related to cardiac function and all sorts of things like that. In oncology, there's a wide variety of anatomic and cellular imaging, molecular, genetics in particular of cancers and tumors, have led really to quantified risk scores, staging, treatment matching. But in mental health, there hasn't been enough of that. And one of the things we've wanted to do is really understand how can we measure continuously, more objectively outside the clinic. And to that, we've thought about using smartphones and wearables. And certainly we're not the first ones to do it. So we're following sort of a trend, a rising trend of trying to better measure mental health and capture what happens outside of clinical visits. And the goal is to fill in the blanks, predict trajectories of what's going to happen. So how do we get started on that path? That's obviously an ambitious goal. So one of the ways we were thinking about this is how do we start to create new measures and new metrics is relating to existing ones. And that gets into all sorts of validity when you come up with new metrics. In this case, focusing on criterion validity. One of the things that's when people started thinking about validity, historically, they've realized that most diagnostic concepts have not been shown to be valid in certain senses, but many of them possess high utility. So while the validity of relating to other measures is great, and that's where we're going to really start and where I'm going to show you some early findings that we have here, ultimately the goal is really the utility, in that we want to use this in a clinical setting to make better predictions, better treatment matching. But in the near term, what we're going to focus on is showing how new measures do or do not relate to existing metrics and predicting those. And so focusing on the criterion validity. But in the long term, really our goal is to show how these new measures have practical utility in predicting outcomes and treatment responses, I noted. And there's some links here you could follow up on. So what do I mean by scalable real-world digital platforms? Again, thinking about mobile and wearables. So what we've done is built a mood study app. For now, it's an Android version of the app that can measure passively, continuously, a number of behaviors using a smartphone. And we've deployed that into a study, and I'll get into some of the details soon, on a number of projects. And the Verily Study Watch is something that we've developed, a wearable that's meant for clinical studies, to measure physiology and behaviors over time, again, passively and continuously, and more objectively. We've deployed in a number of studies, and I'll focus on one of them here. Of note, we've also put that into a number of cardiology studies, given the cardiac measures, and I'll mention a little bit about that later. Overall, what is our goal is to transform the sensors into clinical insights. We want to take the user devices that people are using and wearing, look at the sensors and the sensor data, convert that to physiological and behavioral features, and then relate those to clinical outcomes and clinical predictions in getting utility. This sort of summed up in the concept of digital phenotyping that JP Onnela at Harvard School of Public Health had coined. So this should be a familiar concept to many of you. So what do I mean by the Mood app smartphone-based platform? Let me dive into some details. So there are lots of different sensors on the smartphone that you have, whether it's Android or iPhone, which are obviously the two main phones that are out there. There are environmental sensors, including light and proximity and ambient noise. There's all sorts of APIs, or basically programs on the phone that are running that calculate all sorts of things like physical activity that you've probably seen, sometimes sleep. Then there are other things that are happening and how you use the phone, device usage, whether you're making phone calls or texts, and with whom. Again, we think of that in a privacy-preserving way, looking only at hashed versions of those things. But then also there's raw data of accelerometer and gyroscope, how you're moving the phone and things like that. Just one example, if you're thinking about, I want to estimate exercise, you can look directly at some of the raw data. You can look at those APIs that I mentioned before. You can look at the context of where you are. You're inside or you're outside. Where are you exactly? Are you using the phone in a certain way or not? You can combine these different sensors to better understand particular domains of interest. We also actually augment a lot of these passive data collection with rich real-world tests. So on the one hand, we have clinical data collection, which are more the standard surveys, PHQ-9, other ecological momentary assessments about mood. And we want to augment that with all the real-world data. So there's a lot of passive data that I talked about, but there's also active tasks, asking people to record a voice diary about their past week, or a text diary to type it in, sort of things that have happened to them in the past week. And we pair those also with specific prompts for voice and text, asking them to read some certain text or type certain text, and those serve as reference data sets for us to compare to. Now, there's also the Verily Study Watch on the other hand. And there are a bunch of sensors that we've put into the Verily Study Watch, including an optical sensor, the PPG, the photoplethysmogram, or the cardiac sensors that are meant to capture blood flow and heart rate. There's electrical sensors like the ECG, the electrocardiogram. There's the movement, the inertial momentum units, looking at, that is the accelerometer and gyroscope, looking at how the watch is moved. And there are environmental sensors, for example, like temperature, that measure the temperature at the skin when a person's wearing the watch. Now, for both of those platforms, both the app-based platform and the study watch, one of the key points that we focused on and spent a lot of time in thinking about is really what we call user-centric design. That's one of the advantages in doing these sorts of work in industry, where we can think of how do we engage the users in ways that might not be done in academic studies and academic settings. So in the app, what we did was build a chat interface, which really has an intuitive, highly flexible approach to asking people to do surveys. It offers some novelty and delight, and really in practice, and I'll show this a little bit later, that we really saw that the adherence to, for example, people doing the Patient Health Questionnaire 9 survey, asking about depression over the past week or 2 weeks, had adherence levels as high as 80%. Really, people were feeling that it humanizes the experience and felt like they were interacting with humans, even if they know it was really a robot. Similarly, we asked people to do those voice diaries that I mentioned, or text diaries as well. And again, we tried to make it a relatively simple interface, make it engaging. We also found high adherence there, and people found that particularly engaging as well. One of the other things we did, and that's very important, given all of the sensitivity around the data that we're collecting, is being very transparent about the types of data that are collected. And certainly we have a traditional informed consent form that's quite detailed, but here what we wanted to do was have key reminders in very plain language. For example, saying the precise location data collected in the study could be used to identify where I spend time, such as at my home, a gym, or a movie theater, so that people really can understand what they're getting into and go into the study with eyes wide open. And what we saw is over time, certainly there's some decline in the amount of adherence and people engaging in the app, and in this case, looking at doing their PHQ-9s, but we actually even tested and randomly tested different incentive levels. and those are the numbers in total that they got for the beginning of the study for the entire 12 weeks. And we saw very high adherence, and that's where I got the 80% rate on average. And that was higher than some of the studies that people had seen in the literature. Now, on the study watch side, what we actually saw is that designing a relatively simple study watch that felt like sort of traditional watch in some senses, but also had more state-of-the-art features was kind of important, such as an e-ink screen, tactile response, and things like that. So really, we focused on the design, keeping it classic, legible, and versatile to make it feel like a watch that people of all age ranges would be willing to wear to some degree or another. And again, as I mentioned, we really kept it with a simple tactile user interface, the e-ink display with certain options, only 3 buttons, but certain vibrating options. For example, when someone does an electrocardiogram, they can know that they were done, they get feedback on that, etc. So now that we've built these technologies, we wanted to deploy them in large-scale studies to really give us the best chance at relating some of these new metrics to clinical outcomes. So in that light, we've actually been running these project baseline mood study. We ran a pilot study that ended basically 2 years ago, and we've been actively running this follow-up larger scale machine learning study, project baseline mood study 2. So what are these studies? Just in brief, that pilot study had around 600 people enrolled who were depressed individuals starting treatment. The study ran 12 weeks. And again, the idea was to relate the real world data to the traditional clinical data, and I'll get into some of the details later. As a follow-up study, what we've been running is this project baseline mood study 2, which is actually now a 3-month study at the beginning, followed by a 9-month optional period where there are fewer engagements, but the passive smartphone data continues to be collected. There are also ongoing engagements so that we have some clinical data going forward as well. So the other study that we've deployed our technologies in this case, the Verily study watch, was in this Aurora study of post-trauma, which is an NIH-funded study, and I'll give you some details about that now. So just taking a step back, when someone suffers a trauma, afterwards, the post-traumatic neuropsychiatric outcomes are very common, and they're varied, right? So some people might end up with no adverse outcome. Some people might end up suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, major depressive disorder, musculoskeletal pain, or traumatic brain injury. The problem is there's no real algorithms that are robust to predict, diagnose, or treat. So really, we need data to help build some algorithms. And the issue is that some of these can be actually comorbid and overlapping. So hypothesis is that wearables, phone sensors, biological data can lead to such a model that can help us better understand who will suffer from post-traumatic outcomes and when. So what this is an NIMH-funded 5,000-person longitudinal study where there's some industry partners, including Verily, contributing the study watch, Harvard and University of North Carolina, McLean Hospital in Boston as well. And there are a whole range of diverse data streams that are tracked over time. The important data that I'll focus on today, or important at least from the Verily perspective, has been the study watch data that is our product, and we're trying to look at that. But obviously, there's a lot of other data streams that will be released to the public when the study completes. And as part of that, there'll be a lot of interesting findings that can be made, and I'll give you some examples of what we're starting to see from the study watch. So when we start thinking about data collection, one of the important things, as I noted earlier, is data quality, right? Junk in, junk out if you're building machine learning models, but we don't want junk going in, we want good data going in. So we have to understand the properties of the data so that we could better characterize it and use that to our advantage in the following stages of deriving physiological and behavioral metrics and then relating those to clinical outcomes. So again, as I noted earlier, our near-term goal is to show how the new measures relate to existing metrics. Again, that's part of a longer-term strategy where we really want to show the utility in making a difference in clinical impact. But for now, I'm going to focus on that today. So when we think of clinical prediction, there are 3 stages that we frame the problem as. One stage is understanding the sensor data, collecting the data, quality control, raw sensor data, maybe the surveys as well. There's PHQ-9, for example. Then what we've been doing is focusing on taking those raw sensor data into various combinations and constructing behavioral features, physiological features, doing quality control on that data, understanding the missingness, imputing perhaps, and then using that as I said, to relate those to clinical outcomes. And those relation to clinical outcomes in the stage 3 can be univariate correlations, multivariate correlations, and you can look at different versions of the clinical outcomes, maybe the absolute value of the PHQ-9 or clinically significant changes in the PHQ-9. Again, if we were focusing on depression, there are obviously multiple clinical metrics that we may look at. So I'm going to focus now on stage 1, which is the quality control of the sensor data. And first, I'll start again with the app, looking at the data that we've collected in the Project Baseline Mood Studies. So I'll start here with a multiple choice question. What are mobile phones? A, are they clinical measurement devices? B, scientific measurement devices? C, fun and useful computers in our hands and pockets? And I hope you realize that the answer is C. They are fun and useful computers in our hands and pockets. They are not clinical measurement devices. They are not scientific measurement devices. They are not built that way. They're not intended to be that. Nevertheless, they can be informative about clinical and scientific questions, but the data is going to suffer from inaccuracy and missingness, and we need to take that into account so that we can properly understand the data and use it to positive effect in clinical research and clinical applications. So, what have we seen? So we've seen that the data is messy. And what do I mean by that? So I mean, for example, there's lots of missing data. People might switch phones. When they switch phones, some of the new phones, certain phones might not have certain sensors activated. There might not be an ambient light sensor, for example, on certain phones. This is just an example of some of the plots we might see when we look at the overall summaries of the data. So our idea, and this isn't a complete novel idea, and I'll mention some of the literature on this in a second, is that we are going to apply quality control to the data and then follow up with feature engineering to really extract insights. I'll get into some of that later. So what have we been doing? We've been looking at calculating quality control metrics so we can know, is there sufficient data on a particular day? As an example, what I'll look at here is regularly sampled data that is ideally intended to be captured frequently and at fixed intervals. For example, if we're measuring the light sensor from a particular phone, we might instruct the phone to collect the data at 1 minute intervals. And ideally, we'd get 1,400 samples per day. But of course, the phone might preempt all sorts of calculations to try to save battery because the user is doing all sorts of other things. And we might end up with fewer samples or samples that are sampled irregularly. So what we've done here is started to use a measure called the Kish effective sample size to classify days into either missing, bad, decent, or good. And basically what it's doing is 1 over the sum of the squares of the durations between the ith and the I plus first measurement. So basically, if you had perfectly uniformly sampled data, let's say you had the 1440 if you were sampling once a minute, then you'd end up with an effective sample size that's exactly equal to the sample size of 1440. But if you have a lot of gaps in the data and large gaps in the data, then your sample size will be smaller in proportion to the metric that's listed here. So what can you do once you start calculating these things? You can start doing all sorts of quality control metrics, and you can ask, how are the different sensors performing relative to each other? On the top, we have what we call the ping sensor, which is just keeping track of how long that the app is actually running per day. We're looking at across all participant days from the study. You can look at ambient audio data or location and see that location is tracked, sampled less frequently than you might think. That's often because the phone tends to downsample when the phone isn't being moved in order to save battery. So what we understand is that different sensors behave differently, and we might need to sample them and treat them slightly differently. Just as an example of what we can do is, in this case, we're looking at audio data quality. We can ask a question, what fraction of participants who start the study are still giving us sensor data at the end of the first 3 months? So if we ask the question that way, we can say, oh, well, people that completed the study, the missingness is fairly constant, around 5%. That sounds pretty good. If we ask the question a slightly different way and ask, of the people who started the first 3 months of the study, what does the missingness actually look like across all those people? And obviously, some people don't stay in the study. Then the missingness rises to 20%. So we estimate that their sensor retention, as we call it, might be anywhere between 80 and 95%. That's still pretty good. So we have a lot of data, for example, in this audio sensor, which is tracking the ambient noise level of the room where people are in. Now, if we look at the study watch and we look at the Aurora study, a post-trauma where we deploy the study watch, we can look at certain missingness patterns that arise in the data. So what we found is that there really are different types of missingness depending on the behaviors of the sensors, and these aren't totally surprising. Just as a comparison, we have on the left people taking flash surveys on the phone app that's part of the study, and we see over time, obviously people are going to do fewer surveys, not surprisingly, and the same is sort of true for the sleep data, that where the missingness goes up over time, people are wearing the watch less. There's not really a cyclical pattern, so it's sort of an irregular missingness pattern. On the other hand, with the cardiac data and motion data, because of the way people wear their watch and the activities that they do, certain sensors will have better quality at certain points of the day. So if we average that across all users, what we see is really there are some cyclical patterns to the missingness. And that's something important that we need to take into account when we're deriving the behavioral features and interpreting them as we try to understand how those relate to clinical outcomes. So what do I mean by deriving physiological and behavioral metrics? Now that we've been looking at the data, the question is, can we derive some interpretable physiological and behavioral metrics that we ultimately would like to relate to the clinical outcomes? So what do I mean by that? Again, we're up to the stage 2 of constructing these features. Let me dive right in what I mean by that on the app side. So for example, we might be thinking about sleep or physical activity, or what type of environment someone's in, or from the voice diaries, we might be looking at natural language processing or voice characteristics, but also from how and where people are using the phone, we can understand where they spend their time at a high level. Are they at home? Are they work? Or what kind of routine are they keeping or not keeping? Are they using the phone in the middle of the night? Are they using social media? And are they making phone calls on a regular basis and texting on a regular basis? So what we actually see, just as an example here with location, is that even simple location data processing, where we take these raw GPS, we cluster them, and we start labeling them with home, work, commute, things like that, maybe high-level places that are visited, like gym, and we see that even that can yield insights about routine, as I mentioned earlier, where you can see that the location clustering over 12 weeks can show a pretty strong pattern where people are going to work, spending time at home and work, except for the weekends. And then this participant, their homestay spikes in the middle, where I say homestay spikes this week. Maybe they are on vacation, maybe they're out sick, maybe they're depressed. But either way, you can see that routine or disruptions to routine can be captured using these technologies. So that's an important insight that we started to see. Then taking a look at the study watch data, what did we do there? So really, there are key time series data from the Verily study watch. There are 3 key categories. There's the PPG, the photoplethysmogram, which gives what we call the cardiac variables, like continuous heart rate and continuous heart rate variability. And then there's the accelerometer, where we can use that for understanding motion, for example, ambulatory time and step count. And then there's sleep metrics, which we can actually get derived from both the accelerometer and the PPG combined. We can look at when someone wakes up, when they fall asleep, how many times they wake up in the middle of the night, sleep efficiency, things like that. So now a goal is to take the data and that we derived all those physiological and behavioral metrics and relate those non-traditional digital data to more traditional outcomes in an attempt to see, is what we're seeing valid? And again, this is only the near-term goal. Again, I'm emphasizing this point a few times because we really want to show how the measures relate to existing metrics as a stepping stone to showing that they're useful in having clinical impact, in making better clinical decisions. So in the clinical prediction space, we think of this as a supervised machine learning problem where we have features in a machine learning sense of mobile and wearable data, and we'd like to build a machine learning model that can relate those to clinical outcomes. And again, we can think of it as univariate, multivariate models, and we can look at different types of clinical outcomes. In this case, as an example, the PHQ-9 relating to depression. So what have we done in the Project Baseline Mood study relating to depression using the smartphone app? So as an example of a univariate correlation, what we do is we see moderate correlation of diary sentiment with PHQ-9. So let me unpack that for a second. So what we did is we took the audio diaries that people recorded. We used Google Cloud natural language processing to transcribe those audio diaries to text. We took that text and ran it through the Google Cloud natural language sentiment classifier. And what we looked at was how does the language sentiment that people are speaking in the unstructured audio diary compare to that PHQ-9 survey, the structured PHQ-9 survey that they took on the same week that they did the audio diary. And what we found is that there's a negative correlation, meaning there are more negative spoken words during weeks of increased depression. Again, not surprising, but it's still nice that we can recover that in showing that there are non-traditional ways of capturing people's depression through a diary that might be more engaging than doing a PHQ-9. One of the next goals, though, is to take those behavioral features, including the things from the audio diaries, but also things from the passive sensors, combine those all, and look at how can we build a predictive model of PHQ-9. So an early multivariate model that we have from our pilot study, we built a very simple model using penalized logistic regression to predict binarized depression state of whether someone's depressed or not depressed, PHQ-9 of 10 or above or lower, using 35 behavioral features in 1,900 participant weeks, 1,200 depressed versus 704 not depressed. We did five-fold cross-validation. We get an area under the curve of 0.65. So what we actually see, there is information content in these metrics that can help us relate to PHQ-9. Again, the end goal isn't to necessarily relate to PHQ-9. The end goal is to show clinical utility in predicting better outcomes and making better treatment choices. But the fact that there's information content in these measures already is something that's encouraging results. Now, on the study watch side, that study's ongoing as well, but what have we seen in some earlier results? So just an example of how we think about this is, an example is looking at step counts over the course of days and looking at this plot over here for a particular person. You can see multiple things that might relate to depression. You might see changes in sleep offset, which is delay in activity when you delay in step counts. You might see sleep disturbances when someone might have activity in the middle of the night, where they're wearing the watch overnight. They might have a reduction of physical movement overall, and they might have changes in sleep onset. So they have extended activity where they're staying up later than they might ordinarily. So their routine is disrupted in certain ways. So just focusing on sleep features, what we started to look at, and there are a number of different sleep features. I listed some of them earlier. Here, we started to just look in aggregate and ask, are there differences between the depressed and not depressed cohort? And again, here we could look at the week 8 depression based on the PROMIS scale that people were completing. And we start seeing that certain features come up as being statistically significantly different between those cohorts, maybe sleep onset and sleep offset and sleep efficiency. But we did look at that broadly. The question was, though, can we build a multivariate model that took into account all of these features? Let's see how well that could perform. So what we did was use a relatively simple model. Here we did something a little bit more sophisticated than earlier. We used a deep neural network with GRUs, gated recurrent units. We actually found similarly, actually, that the AUC under the ROC curve was 0.66 for predicting week 8 depression from the first 8 weeks of sleep data. But one of the questions is, when we start getting into all these types of data, is how do we represent the features under the hood, so to speak, when we're building these models? Do we look at the median summaries per day for across all days of a week to predict that week? Or do we look across all days in the entire, let's say, 8-week period? And what we actually found is by feeding in all of the raw features and the subtleties and nuances can be picked up by the model, and that actually seems to increase performance, both in looking at the AUC or an F1 score performance, model performance. What we also found was that missingness patterns can augment the sleep signal. So the time when data is missing, which we looked at and we've characterized right earlier, I showed you that, that's actually not surprising, and that's been found earlier where in the paper that I'm mentioning, there's really coverage of collected accelerometer and GPS data actually significantly associated with future survey scores. So again, maybe not surprising, but consistent with what has been found in the literature, that missingness itself can be a signal in addition to the sleep signal when there's data as well. So to wrap up, in conclusion, what we've done at Verily in terms of thinking of mental health measurement is really rebuilt scalable real-world digital platforms with a focus on user-centric design to keep people engaged and sort of adherent as part of our studies so that they like using the product that we're using. We deployed it in those large-scale studies really to give us a best shot at creating large-scale machine learning models of clinical outcomes. First, we had to focus, of course, on data quality and deriving physiological and behavioral metrics that are both interpretable, but also can overcome some of the data quality issues, especially that are inherent in a smartphone. And lastly, what I've shown is that using clinical modeling and even relatively simple machine learning models can relate the non-traditional digital data to the traditional outcomes, and that shows that there's criterion validity to a lot of the new metrics that we're deriving, and it's really good first steps towards validity more generally, but really the ultimate goal is utility so that we can show that these new metrics can outshine existing metrics that don't capture data outside the clinic, aren't as continuous, and aren't as objective. And that's obviously one of the long-term goals that we're thinking about here. So, summary, I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.